Good evening. What would you do if you arrived at your hotel after traveling all day and there were no rooms available? Or what if there was only one room available? A room in the attic, the worst room in the hotel. Would you accept it? A powerful lesson in leadership occurred on March 8th, 1864. It was a rainy afternoon in Washington, D.C., and a man walked into the Willard Hotel with his 13-year-old son in search of a room. And the man looked unimpressive, unshaven, unkept. There was mud and dirt spattered about the linen duster that covered most of his uniform. He was only 5'8". He weighed just under 140 pounds. Nothing stood out about this man. And the clerk looked him over with very condescending eyes and decided there were no rooms available, except a room in the attic, worst room in the hotel. The man quickly and quietly accepted the room, and then he signed his name on the hotel ledger. U.S. Grant and Son, Galena, Illinois. Upon reading the name, the clerk was stunned that he had not recognized the most famous man in America at the time, aside from Abraham Lincoln. And he quickly made other accommodations. Parlor number 6, the best room in the hotel where Lincoln had stayed just a few days before his inauguration. But you see, for General Grant, any room would do. He simply did not want to call attention to himself. What a powerful thought in the age of selfie. Now, this story breaks no historical ground. Grant's unassuming arrival has been told time and again by historians, but they're missing something. What they never talk about is how Grant could have responded. He could have grabbed the clerk by the collar and said, "Do you know who I am? I'm General Grant, savior of the Union, hero of Fort Donelson, conqueror of Vicksburg, deliverer of Chattanooga, the man who's protecting this very capital. And you offer me a room in the attic?" He could have belittled the clerk. He could have had the clerk fired for disrespecting him. He could have taken a moment to explain his greatness and how he was in Washington to receive the rank of Lieutenant General, Chief of all Union armies. And with the White House only a few blocks away, he could have asked President Lincoln for a room. He was, after all, unconditional surrender Grant. Instead, Grant accepted the lesser room. But it did not take long before he was given the best room. What's also missing from this story is a follow-up with the clerk. In fact, I would argue that's the most intriguing part of the story. You see, we know the clerk repented and gave Grant the best room and quickly spread word that he was staying at the hotel. But we don't know what happened later on that evening when the clerk got home, when his family asked him, "How was your day?" That's the story that I want to hear. You see, I would like to think that the clerk was deeply impacted by Grant's profound display of humility. I would like to think that years later, even after the Civil War had ended, and even after Grant's presidency was over, that the clerk still told that story to his grandchildren. Humility has a way of transcending generations, if we'll only allow it. When I teach students about leadership, real leadership, I often share a principle I've titled the lesser seat. I use that story and others to convey how we must first model the actions of character and integrity and leadership in our own lives before we attempt to scold others for their poor examples. But what exactly is the lesser seat? You see, the lesser seat represents those opportunities in life to esteem others higher than ourselves. The lesser seat is a departure from the braggadocio, selfie, elitist, narcissistic mentality. Trophies, awards, and status mean nothing to the leader who takes the lesser seat. The lesser seat is not false humility. It's not a, "Hey, look at me, I'm so humble" facade. The lesser seat is an acknowledgement that while we are grateful for our positions, our tags, our titles, there's always someone better suited for the task. The lesser seat is genuine character modeling, based upon honesty, integrity, humility, and service before self. The lesser seat, I believe, starts with us. But you see, there's always a cost to taking the lesser seat. That's why very few leaders go after it. Egos get bruised. Swallowing pride, for some, is a tough swallow. Feelings get hurt. Feelings of being unappreciated will linger. Your actions will almost certainly go unnoticed, without thanks. And to stand at the back of the line and to allow others to take your place in line and to not be next in line for that promotion, that award, that accolade requires great restraint. But our society is desperately in need of leaders who will take the lesser seat. How do I know this? I'm glad you asked. On November 19, 2013, Oxford Dictionary announced its word of the year. You ready for it? Selfie. Can't make that up. The English use of the term had increased by over 17,000% during the previous year. The Pew Research Center has found that over 55% of millennials, and that number's climbing, have reported posting a selfie on social media, but no other generation has been so inclined to do this. Disneyland, the happiest place on earth, had to ban selfie sticks. Instead of enjoying the experience, visitors were trying to take selfies while rides were in progress. Controversy has been stirred involving students taking selfies while on field trips to concentration camps. There's even a Tumblr page dedicated to taking selfies while at funerals. I read one study that was cited in the New York Times. It said that the majority of college students surveyed today preferred receiving praise over having sex. That's when I knew we were in trouble as a nation. Every like, every share, every click, every positive comment we receive from social media may very well boost our self-confidence. But empirical research in psychology now tells us that the constant need for validation through some external source and the constant need for self-promotion is actually damaging our self-confidence when we don't receive the validation through depression. And when we do receive the validation, through narcissism. With the explosion of selfie in American culture, there are serious implications for leaders to consider, particularly when our focus today is so much on the external instead of the internal. You see, the leader in any organization, they may very well be the rock star. But what about the rest of the band? There was a recent article in Psychology Today. It said that we love humble leaders, but we idolize narcissists. But when we as leaders become egocentric, when we become full of self, when we attempt to be the most celebrated employee, trouble is brewing. You see, leaders who take the leap from good to great possess humility. In fact, it was Jim Collins, the author of Good to Great, who said that level 5 leaders were still ambitious, but their focus is on the success of the organization and not their own personal success. Humility, leadership, the lesser seat, it allows you to collaborate with others and also to work with others. Please remember that it was Steve Jobs, the great genius behind Apple and the iPhone, who said that the first 10 people in a company determine its success. He did not say the first. Now, we use that quote to speak about the importance of the hiring process, but it also speaks to collaboration and the flow of synergy in an organization. You see, self-absorbed leaders hinder collaboration. And we know they hinder collaboration because self-absorbed leaders rarely seek feedback from others. They rarely welcome input. They rarely admit to their own mistakes. The lesser seat calls for leadership to acknowledge their own limitations and to realize they are not the center of the universe. The lesser seat does not consist of low self-esteem. Please remember that C.S. Lewis told us, humility is not that we think less of ourselves. It's that we think of ourselves less. The lesser seat has power because it's unexpected. How often do you meet someone, and within the first 5 minutes of talking to them, they explain to you their credentials? How often do we try to one-up each other in our conversations? How often do we talk about where we've been and what we know instead of who we are as people? My best friend is a pilot in the United States Air Force. He has a joke that he likes to tell. I'll try it out on you here this evening. How do you know if you're talking to a pilot? Don't worry, they will always tell you. We often misinterpret humility as a form of personal weakness. We should instead see humility as a sign of service. We're here to serve. It's about service. There are several benefits to taking the lesser seat. I'll share 3 of them with you here this evening. The lesser seat builds self-awareness. Leaders need to be aware of their own selves. They need an objective view of themselves. They need to see their cracks and their flaws. They need to see that they're fallible if they are to lead properly. The lesser seat builds collaboration. It's an acknowledgement that you don't have all of the answers, but you are surrounded by the answers. The lesser seat builds those around you. Isn't it amazing how when the spotlight is not on you, you can see the beauty and the talent in the people right before your eyes? Some of the greatest leaders in history took the lesser seat. Abraham Lincoln, he was certainly one of them. And the story goes that one cold November evening, President Lincoln and Secretary of State William Seward called on General George B. McClellan at his home. And when they arrived there, the general was not home. And so they waited in his living room. And when General McClellan arrived home, he walked straight past the President of the United States, who was sitting in his living room with the Secretary of State, and he went immediately upstairs, didn't say a word. And after about an hour, he sent his maid down to tell the President and the Secretary of State that he had gone to bed for the evening. Now, everybody who observed this great sign of disrespect probably expected Lincoln to relieve the general of his command, to fire him right there on the spot. He didn't do that. Here's what he said. He said, "I will hold General McClellan's horse," and I would add, polish his boots, "if he will only bring us success." Lincoln was able to work with people who despised him in order to accomplish the mission. Only humility will allow you to do that. Of course, there have been several others. Jane Addams, founder of the Hull House, took the lesser seat for her entire career. She's the first woman to earn the Nobel Peace Prize, and she pioneers social reform in America at a time when most people turned a blind eye to suffering, inequality, and the rights of women. General George C. Marshall took the lesser seat for his entire career, serving in the shadows while all the great men were out front. But especially after World War II, he was asked to write a book about himself. He was offered over $1 million to do so. He said no. He simply could not write a book about himself that might also speak negatively of others. What a powerful thought in the age of selfie. Dr. King took the lesser seat for his entire ministry, but especially in the days leading up to his assassination, when he was in Memphis, fighting on behalf of sanitation workers, when most people could have cared less. Now, when you hear the name Nelson Mandela, you probably think of that great former president of South Africa who helped to end apartheid and change a nation. But you see, I get a different mental picture. It looks something like that. You see, few people know that Nelson Mandela refused to allow anyone to make his bed for him. And the story goes that he was invited to speak in Shanghai, China. And when he arrives there in Shanghai, at one of the nicest hotels, his aide comes rushing up to him and says, Nelson, you have to let the hotel staff make your bed here. It would be a great sign of disrespect if you didn't do it. This place requires the utmost in Chinese hospitality. And Nelson Mandela looked at his aide and he said, bring them to me. He called together the entire staff of that hotel. And here's what he said. He said, I do not want to disrespect you, but I have to make my own bed. What a powerful thought in the age of selfie. I recently heard about a leader right here in Topeka, Kansas, who took the lesser seat. You see, I was invited to a public forum for international students at Washburn University. And when I arrived, there were students from China, students from Brazil, students from Japan, and students from Saudi Arabia. And the moderator asked the panelists, what has impacted you the most since you arrived here in the United States and since you arrived at the university? And a student from Saudi Arabia raised his hand and he said, well, I was at a football game with my friend, and we were in the cheap seats, as he called them. And he said that the president of the university came and sat next to them. And he said, my friend nudged me and said, that's the president of the university. That's Dr. Jerry Farley. And he told his friend, impossible, impossible. How could it be that such a great leader would be sitting here next to us in these cheap seats, when in my country, all the leaders would be out front in the plush seats, receiving all the attention? What a powerful thought in the age of selfie. I was first introduced to the concept, the experience, the idea of the lesser seat when I received orders to Fort Carson, Colorado to undergo combat training in preparation for a tour in Iraq. And there was one day after we had marched and trained for several hours that I was walking to the Humvee, and I was approaching the passenger side door to get a ride back to the barracks. And there was an airman who was a few ranks above me, and he grabbed my arm, and he said, what are you doing? You sit in the back. Rank has its privileges. Leadership has its privileges. And only I get to sit up front. He was serious. That day, and every day since then, I've tried to take the lesser seat. And let me tell you, it has made all the difference. Thank you.